Eleanor Jane Harper trembled as her father's calloused hands clutched the bag of coins, the metal clinking together in a sound that seemed to seal her fate like the lid of a coffin. Black Hawk, Colorado, 1878, a town built on gold dreams and broken promises, was about to become her prison. "A fair price for a fair daughter," Tobias Harper declared, his breath heavy with whiskey as he counted the money one more time. "She'll make a fine wife, Blackwood. She knows her way around a kitchen and won't give you no trouble." Jane, as everyone called her, stood rigid in the corner of her family's small cabin, her chest so tight she could barely breathe. At 20 years old, she had always known her father saw her as a burden since her mother died, but she never imagined he would sell her like cattle to the richest, cruelest man in Black Hawk. Augustus Iverson, the mine owner whose grip on the town was as tight as the tunnel supports in his gold mine, smiled with yellowed teeth as he appraised her. "She's skinny, Harper, but I suppose she'll do. My house needs a woman's touch and I need an heir. The arrangements are settled then." Jane's eyes darted to the door, calculating her chances of escape, but where would she go? Her father had gambled away their savings, and now he was gambling with her life to pay his debts. "Please, father," she whispered, but the plea died on her lips as Tobias shot her a warning glance. "You'll do as you're told, girl. Mr. Iverson here is offering you a life of luxury. You should be grateful." Tobias tucked the money into his pocket. "She's yours at the end of the month. That gives her time to pack her things." 2 weeks, Iverson countered, his eyes never leaving Jane's face. "I'm not a patient man." From his position outside the open window, Vincent Wells clenched his jaw so hard he thought his teeth might crack. The young cowboy had been delivering firewood to the Harper cabin when he overheard the exchange. The thought of Jane's sweet, kind Jane, who taught the children at Sunday school and always had a smile for everyone, despite her father's meanness, being sold to a man 3 times her age, made his blood boil. Vin, as most folks called him, had admired Jane from afar for years. They'd exchanged pleasantries at church socials and town gatherings, but he was just a simple ranch hand at the Double R and she was, well, she was everything pure and good in this rough mining town. As he quietly backed away from the cabin, resolution hardened in his chest. 2 weeks. He had 2 weeks to save enough money to buy Jane's freedom from that monster. It seemed impossible. A ranch hand's wages were meager at best, but he would find a way. He had to. The next morning, as dawn broke over the mountains, Vin approached his boss, Randall Rogers, with a proposition. "Double shift, sir. I'll work from sunup to sundown and then some. Whatever needs doing, I'll do it." Rogers, a gruff but fair man in his 50s, eyed him suspiciously. "What's this about, Wells? You in some kind of trouble?" "No, sir. Just need the money. Got my eye on a piece of land." The lie tasted bitter, but Vin couldn't risk word getting back to Iverson about his plan. "Well, I can't pay you double, but I can give you extra work. Thompson just quit, so there's his spot to fill. But you'll work yourself into the ground taking both shifts." "I can handle it," Vin insisted, his blue eyes determined. And so began the most grueling 2 weeks of Vincent Wells' life. By day, he drove cattle, repaired fences, and broke horses for the ranch. By night, he took on the night guard shift, patrolling the property for rustlers and predators. In between, he grabbed an hour or 2 of sleep when he could, often just collapsing in the hay of the barn. On his rare trips into town for supplies, he caught glimpses of Jane. Each time, she looked paler, thinner, like a bird with a broken wing. Once, their eyes met across the dusty Main Street, and he thought he saw a flicker of something hope, perhaps before she quickly looked away. Jane herself was living in a state of quiet desperation. Each night, she prayed for deliverance from her fate. And each morning she woke to the cruel realization that no rescue was coming. Her father had taken to drinking more heavily than usual, celebrating his windfall, while she packed the few possessions she owned into a small trunk. She had considered running away, but with no money and nowhere to go, she knew she wouldn't get far. The mountains surrounding Black Hawk were beautiful but unforgiving. A woman alone would not survive long, and the alternatives working in one of the saloons or brothels that dotted the mining town seemed just as dire as becoming Iverson's unwilling bride. On the 5th day of her 2-week reprieve, Jane was gathering eggs from the chicken coop when she heard a soft whistle. Turning, she saw Vin leaning against the fence, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "Mr. Wells," she said, surprised, "can I help you with something?" He glanced around nervously before speaking. "Miss Harper, I need to talk to you. It's important." There was an urgency in his voice that made her step closer. "What is it?" "I know about Iverson," he said quietly. "I know what your father did." Jane's cheeks flamed with shame, and she looked down at the basket of eggs in her hands. "The whole town probably knows by now. I'm going to help you," Vin continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm earning money as much as I can. By the end of next week I'll have enough to what?" Jane interrupted, a spark of anger flaring through her embarrassment. "To buy me instead. Am I to be traded from one man to another like a prized mare?" Vin's face fell. "No, Miss Harper, that's not it at all. The money is for you to give you a choice. Freedom to go where you want, be who you want. I'm not asking for anything in return." Jane stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, but found only sincerity in his tired eyes. She noticed then the dark circles under them, the way his clothes hung more loosely on his frame than they had a week ago. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked softly. Vin shifted uncomfortably. "Because no one should be forced into something like this. And because I've always thought you deserved better than this town could give you." Before Jane could respond, they heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Vin quickly stepped back, tipping his hat. "Just checking if your father needed any work done around the place, Miss Harper. Give him my regards." As he walked away, Jane felt something she hadn't felt in days, a tiny flutter of hope. The days passed in a blur for Vin. His body ached from the constant work, his hands were raw and blistered, and he could barely keep his eyes open during meals. But each day brought him closer to his goal. Rogers paid him for Thompson's position as well as his own, and Vin took on odd jobs around town during his few hours off, chopping wood, mucking out stables, whatever paid. He kept track of his earnings in a small notebook, watching the numbers grow slowly, too slowly. With just 4 days left before Jane was to be handed over to Iverson, Vin was still short by nearly half the amount the mine owner had paid. Desperation drove him to consider options he would normally avoid. There were poker games in the back rooms of Black Hawk saloons where a man could win a fortune or lose everything. Vin had never been much for gambling, but time was running out. The Wild Rose Saloon was crowded that night, filled with miners spending their weekly pay on whiskey and women. Vin made his way to the back room where he knew the serious card players gathered. He had exactly $20 to his name, all he could risk. "Wells, ain't seen you in here before," called out Frank Miller, one of the regulars. "Finally decided to try your luck." Vin nodded tightly, taking a seat at the table. "Just for tonight." 4 hours later, Vin stumbled out of the saloon, his pockets empty. He'd lost everything, not just the $20 he'd brought, but an additional $30 he'd borrowed from one of the other players when his luck seemed to be turning. Now he was worse off than when he started, with a debt to repay and Jane's situation more desperate than ever. He spent that night sitting on the bank of Clear Creek, watching the moonlight ripple across the water, trying to think of another way. By morning, he had his answer. It was dangerous, possibly illegal, but he was out of options. The Iverson mine was one of the most productive in Colorado, pulling gold from the earth that made its owner one of the wealthiest men in the territory. It was also known for its dangerous conditions and the frequency with which miners were injured or killed. But it paid better than ranch work, much better, especially if a man was willing to take the most dangerous shifts. Vin approached the mine foreman at dawn. "Looking for work," he said simply. The foreman, a squat man with a perpetual scowl, looked him up and down. "Ever worked a mine before?" "No, but I'm strong and I learn quick." "HMPH. We lost 2 men in a collapse last week. Need replacements. Pays $5 a day for a 12-hour shift. Double for night work, but that's the worst air and the most dangerous tunnels." "I'll take both shifts," Vin said without hesitation. The foreman laughed. "You'll be dead inside a week. No man can work 24 hours in those conditions." "I'll work the day shift and half the night. That's, 18 hours. I can manage 6 hours of sleep." The foreman shrugged. "Your funeral. Start today. Get yourself some boots and gloves from the company store. They'll take it out of your first pay." The mine was everything Vin had heard about and worse. The tunnels were narrow and poorly supported, the air thick with dust that coated his lungs and made every breath a struggle. The work was backbreaking, swinging a pickaxe for hours, loading ore carts, navigating dark passages by the dim light of an oil lamp. But the pay was as promised. $7.50 a day for 18 hours of work. In 3 days, he could make what would take him 2 weeks at the ranch. It might be enough if his body could withstand the punishment. Jane, meanwhile, had only 3 days left of freedom. Her father had spent almost all of Iverson's money on drink and gambling, confirming her suspicions that he cared nothing for her welfare. She'd seen Vin only once since their conversation by the chicken coop, glimpsing him entering the mine as she passed on her way to the general store. He'd looked terrible, exhausted and filthy, and she wondered what had driven him to such desperate work. That evening, as she was preparing supper, there was a knock at the door. Her father was at the saloon as usual, so Jane answered it herself, surprised to find Miriam Wells, Vin's mother, standing on the porch. "Mrs. Wells," Jane said, confused, "is everything all right?" The older woman's face was tight with worry. "I'm looking for Vincent. Have you seen him? He hasn't been home in days, and when I asked at the ranch, Rogers said he'd taken work at the mine. I'm worried sick about him." Jane's stomach dropped. "The mine? Iverson's mine?" "Yes, Mrs. Wells confirmed. Rogers said he was working double shifts, trying to earn money quickly. I can't imagine why he'd do something so dangerous unless he was in some kind of trouble." Jane swallowed hard, guilt washing over her as she realized what Vin was doing, killing himself to save her. "Mrs. Wells, I think I might know why. Your son is trying to help me, my father. He's arranged for me to marry Mr. Iverson against my wishes. Vin overheard, and I think he's trying to earn enough to help me get away." Miriam's eyes widened. "Oh, my dear girl. That sounds just like my Vincent, always trying to right the world's wrongs." She reached out and took Jane's hand. "But the mine is killing him. When I caught a glimpse of him yesterday, he could barely stand." "I need to stop him," Jane said firmly. "This isn't his burden to bear." "Be careful," Miriam warned. "Augustus Iverson is not a man to cross, and if your father has already accepted payment—" "I'll find a way," Jane promised, "and I'll make sure Vin comes home." The next morning, Jane rose before dawn and made her way to the mine. She waited near the entrance as the day shift arrived, scanning the tired faces of the men until she spotted Vin among them. Even in the early morning light, she could see how the work had ravaged him. His face was gaunt, streaked with coal dust that couldn't hide the pallor beneath. He walked with a slight limp, and his once bright blue eyes were dull with exhaustion. "Vin," she called, hurrying toward him. He looked up, startled, then glanced around nervously. "Jane, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be seen with me." "If Iverson finds out, I don't care," she interrupted. "Your mother came to me last night. She's worried sick about you. And so am I. You have to stop this, Vin. You're killing yourself." He shook his head stubbornly. "I'm fine, and I'm close, Jane. Just one more day of work and I'll have enough to get you away from here. You can go to Denver, start a new life." "Not at the cost of your life," she insisted. "Please, Vin, there has to be another way." Before he could respond, the mine whistle blew, signaling the start of the shift. "I have to go," he said. "Meet me tonight at Clear Creek where it bends past the old cottonwood. 8 o'clock. We can talk then." Jane nodded, watching with a heavy heart as he disappeared into the dark mouth of the mine with the other workers. She spent the day in a state of anxious determination, formulating a plan. By the time evening came, she had made her decision. She would not let Vin sacrifice himself for her. Instead, she would take control of her own fate. At 8 o'clock, she was waiting by the creek, a small bundle of possessions at her feet. When Vin emerged from the trees, he looked even worse than he had that morning. He was moving slowly, one arm pressed against his side as if in pain. "You're hurt," Jane said immediately, moving to help him. "Just a bruise," he dismissed, though his wince told a different story. A support beam shifted. "I was lucky the man next to me wasn't." "This has to stop," Jane said firmly. "I've made my decision, Vin. I'm leaving tonight. I have a little money saved, not much, but enough to get me to the next town. From there, I'll find work, make my own way." Vin shook his head. "It's too dangerous for a woman alone, and your father, Iverson, they'll come after you." "Not if they think I'm dead," Jane replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "There's a girl who drowned in the creek last spring. They buried her on the hill, but no one visits her grave. I'm going to leave my shawl on the bank, let them think I took my own life rather than marry Iverson." "Jane, no," Vin protested. "The mountains are too harsh, the roads too dangerous. Let me help you. I have almost enough money now." "At what cost?" she challenged. "Look at yourself, Vin. You can barely stand. Another day in that mine might kill you. I won't have that on my conscience." They argued back and forth, neither willing to yield until finally Vin made a counter-proposal. "One more day," he pleaded. "Give me one more day in the mine. I'll have enough by tomorrow night. Then we'll both leave together. I know these mountains, Jane. I can keep you safe until we reach Denver." "Both of us?" Jane asked, surprised. "You'd leave Black Hawk too?" Vin nodded. "There's nothing for me here except my mother, and she's been talking about joining my sister in California anyway. I could find work in Denver or further west. Start fresh." Jane hesitated, considering. The thought of not facing the wilderness alone was tempting, but she couldn't bear the thought of Vin spending another day in that death trap of a mine. "No more mine work," she insisted. "It's too dangerous. We'll leave with what you have now." "It's not enough for two," Vin admitted. "And Iverson paid your father $100. If we don't return that money, he'll hunt us down for theft." Jane sighed, knowing he was right. The mine owner was notorious for tracking down anyone who crossed him, and he had the resources to do it. "There has to be another way to get the money," she said. They sat in silence for a moment, the gentle sound of the creek filling the night. Then Vin straightened, an idea forming. "The payroll," he said quietly. "Tomorrow's payday at the mine. Iverson's clerk brings the cash from the bank in the morning, keeps it in the office safe until the end of the shift." Jane's eyes widened. "Vin, no, that's robbery. If you're caught, not robbery," he corrected. "I'm only taking what would be owed to me for my work. plus the $100 Iverson paid for you, which was wrong in the first place. I'll leave a note explaining, and we'll be long gone before they find it." "It's too risky," Jane protested. "Not as risky as you trying to survive alone in the wilderness, or me spending another day in that mine," Vin countered. "Trust me, Jane. I can do this." They spent the next hour refining the plan. Vin knew the routine of the mine office from his days of employment. The clerk, a nervous man named Simmons, always took his lunch at precisely noon, leaving the office empty for half an hour. The safe wasn't particularly secure. Vin had seen Simmons open it enough times to know the combination was the date of Iverson's wedding anniversary, a fact the mine owner never let anyone forget. "Meet me here tomorrow at 1 o'clock, Vin instructed. "Bring only what you can carry easily. We'll take the old hunting trail north, then cut west toward Central City. From there, we can catch the stage to Denver." Jane nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "Be careful, Vin. Promise me." He reached out tentatively, taking her hand in his rough, calloused one. "I promise." The next day was the longest of Jane's life. She went about her chores as usual, trying to act normal when her father finally emerged from his drunken stupor around midday. He reminded her, with cruel satisfaction, that tomorrow she would be moving to Iverson's mansion on the hill. "You should be grateful," he slurred, helping himself to the stew she'd prepared. "Most girls don't get such an opportunity. Iverson's rich as Mita's." "And just as heartless," Jane muttered under her breath. "What was that?" Her father snapped. "Nothing, father, just talking to myself." As soon as he left for his afternoon visit to the saloon, Jane gathered her things: a change of clothes, her mother's locket, a small Bible, and the $37 she'd saved over the years from selling eggs and doing mending for neighbors. She hid the bundle under her bed, then waited anxiously for the clock to reach noon. Meanwhile, Vin was putting his own plan into action. He had told the foreman he was feeling ill, not a difficult lie to sell, given his appearance, and asked to be assigned to surface work for the day. This gave him the freedom to move around the mining complex without raising suspicion. At 11:50, he positioned himself near the mine office, pretending to repair a piece of equipment. As expected, at exactly noon, Simmons emerged, locked the office door, and headed toward town for his lunch. Vin waited until he was out of sight, then moved quickly. The lock on the office door was simple, and he had it open in seconds using the skills he'd learned in his youth from a horse thief who'd briefly worked at the Double R before being caught and hanged. The office was empty, just as he'd expected. The small safe sat in the corner behind Simmons' desk. Vin approached it, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned the dial carefully. 7/15/62, Iverson's wedding date. The safe clicked open. Inside were several stacks of bills and a leather pouch of gold coins. Vin quickly counted out what he needed: his wages for the days worked, plus the $100 for Jane. He left the rest, true to his word that this wasn't a robbery, just a reclaiming of what was rightfully owed. He scribbled a note explaining his actions, left it in the safe, then closed it. As he turned to leave, the office door swung open, and he found himself face to face with Augustus Iverson himself. "Wells," the mine owner growled, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. "I thought I might find you here. Simmons mentioned you'd been asking strange questions about the payroll schedule." Vin froze, the money clutched in his hand. "Mr. Iverson, I can explain." "Save it," Iverson snapped. "I know exactly what you're doing. You've had your eye on my future bride for years. Everyone in town has seen the way you look at her. Did you think I wouldn't notice when you suddenly started working in my mine? When you began asking about how much I paid for her?" "You can't buy a person," Vin said, straightening his shoulders despite the fear coursing through him. Jane deserves to choose her own fate. Iverson laughed, a cold, harsh sound. Choice is a luxury, boy. In this world, everything and everyone has a price. I paid mine fairly. Now, put the money back in the safe, and I might consider letting you live. Vin knew he was trapped. Iverson was blocking the only exit, and the mine owner was known to be quick with his gun. But he couldn't give up, not when Jane was waiting for him, counting on him. "I'll return the money," Vin said slowly, moving back toward the safe. "Just let me." In a lightning-fast movement, he hurled the heavy ledger from the desk at Iverson's head. The older man ducked, but the distraction gave Vin enough time to lunge forward, tackling Iverson around the waist. They crashed to the floor, Iverson's gun skittering away across the wooden planks. Despite his exhaustion and injuries, Vin fought with the strength of desperation. Iverson was older but powerfully built from his younger days working in the mines before he owned them. They grappled on the floor, trading blows. Vin felt his already bruised ribs crack under one of Iverson's powerful punches, but he didn't relent. He managed to land a solid hit to Iverson's jaw, momentarily stunning the older man. Seizing the opportunity, Vin scrambled to his feet, grabbed the money, and bolted for the door. He burst outside into the bright Colorado sunshine, immediately ducking around the corner of the building in case Iverson recovered his gun. Behind him, he heard Iverson shouting for help. "Thief! Stop him! Wells is stealing the payroll." Vin ran for his life, dodging between buildings, taking the back alleys he knew so well from his years in Black Hawk. He could hear men shouting behind him, the alarm spreading through the mine complex. His side burned with every breath, and he suspected one of his ribs had punctured something important, but he pushed through the pain. Jane was waiting. He couldn't let her down. By the time he reached Clear Creek, he had lost his pursuers, but he knew it wouldn't be long before Iverson organized a proper search. He followed the creek to their meeting spot, praying Jane would be there early. She was. She rose from her hiding place among the willows as soon as she saw him, her face paling at his appearance. "You're hurt," she gasped, rushing to support him as he stumbled. "No time," he panted, each word sending daggers through his chest. "Iverson, he caught me. The whole town will be looking for us soon." Without hesitation, Jane took some of his weight, helping him toward the trail they had agreed on. "Can you make it to Central City?" Vin shook his head. "Too obvious. They'll check the stage. We need another plan." They moved as quickly as they could into the cover of the forest, following game trails that would be harder to track. Vin was struggling more with each step, but he refused to stop. Behind them, they could hear faint shouts as the search began in earnest. "I know a place," Jane said suddenly. "An abandoned cabin. One of the early settlers built it, but it was too far from town to be practical. My mother showed it to me years ago." Vin nodded, conserving his breath. Every step was agony now, but the thought of Jane falling into Iverson's hands kept him moving. The cabin was more of a shack, hidden in a small clearing about 3 miles from town. It was dilapidated but still standing, with a roof that would keep out the rain and walls that would shield them from view. Inside, Jane helped Vin to the single chair that remained intact. In the dim light filtering through the dirty windows, she could finally see the extent of his injuries. His face was badly bruised, and he was holding his side in a way that suggested broken ribs. "Let me see," she said gently, helping him remove his shirt. The bruising on his torso was extensive, with an alarming dark patch on his right side that suggested internal bleeding. Jane bit her lip to keep from crying out in dismay. "It's not as bad as it looks," Vin lied, attempting a smile that turned into a grimace. Jane shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "This is all my fault. If you hadn't tried to help me, I'd do it again, he interrupted, reaching up to brush a tear from her cheek. You're worth it, Jane. She busied herself making him as comfortable as possible, using her shawl as a pillow and her spare dress as a blanket. Then she inspected their supplies, the money Vin had taken, her savings, some bread and jerky she'd brought, and a canteen of water. We should rest here tonight, she decided. You're in no condition to travel further and they'll be watching the roads. Tomorrow we can decide our next move. Vin nodded tiredly, his eyes already closing. Jane sat beside him, watching over him as he slept fitfully, her mind racing with worry and plans. By morning, Vin's condition had worsened. His breathing was shallow and his skin was hot to the touch. Jane knew he needed a doctor, but taking him back to Black Hawk was out of the question. Central City was closer than Denver, but still a hard day's journey on foot, and she wasn't sure Vin could make it. She was contemplating her limited options when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Peering cautiously through a crack in the wall, she saw 3 riders moving slowly through the trees, scanning the ground for tracks. "Search party," she whispered to Vin, who had woken at her movement. "Iverson's men." Vin struggled to sit up. "We need to move." "You can't," Jane insisted. "You'll kill yourself trying." He looked at her with fevered eyes. "Then you go, take the money, get to Denver, I'll lead them away." "No," Jane said firmly. "I'm not leaving you." The riders were getting closer. Jane could now make out their conversations. They were indeed looking for them, and they seemed to know about the cabin. Making a quick decision, Jane gathered their few possessions. "There's a cellar," she whispered. "Mother showed me. It was used to hide from Indian raids in the early days. If we can get down there." With her help, Vin managed to stand. She led him to a corner of the cabin where a worn rug covered a trapdoor. The cellar below was small and musty, but it would hide them if the searchers didn't look too carefully. They had barely closed the trapdoor above them when they heard the cabin door crash open. Through the cracks in the wooden ceiling, they could see boots moving across the floor. "Nothing here," one man called. "Looks like no one's been here in years." "Check everywhere," another voice commanded Iverson himself. "That girl's clever, and Wells knows these mountains." Jane and Vin huddled together in the darkness, hardly daring to breathe as the men stomped around above them. At one point, someone walked right over the trapdoor, and Jane had to press her hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, the searchers finally gave up. "We'll try the old mining camps to the north," Iverson decided. If they're heading for Denver, that's the route they'd take to avoid the main road. The sound of their departure was the sweetest thing Jane had ever heard. She waited a full 30 minutes before daring to open the trapdoor and peer out. "They're gone," she confirmed, helping Vin back up to the cabin floor. His skin was alarmingly hot now, and he could barely support his own weight. "Jane," he said weakly, "you need to go on without me. I'll only slow you down, and in this condition, I'm a danger to you." "Absolutely not," she said, her voice firm despite the fear gripping her heart. "We're in this together now." "Why?" he asked, genuinely puzzled in his fevered state. "Why risk everything for me? You barely know me." Jane smoothed his hair back from his forehead, her touch gentle. "I know enough. I know you were willing to work yourself to death to save me from a fate worse than death. I know you're kind and brave and honest, and I know that when you look at me, I feel seen for the first time in my life." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Vin reached for her hand, his fingers trembling. "I've loved you since the first time I saw you teaching those children at Sunday school," he admitted. "The way you smiled, the patience you showed, I knew then you were someone special." Jane blinked back tears. "Then we have even more reason to survive this together. Rest now. I'm going to find help." While Vin slept, Jane ventured cautiously outside. The cabin was situated near a stream, which provided fresh water, and she was able to find some wild onions and berries to supplement their meager food supplies. More importantly, she recognized some of the herbs her mother had taught her to identify ones with medicinal properties that might help bring down Vin's fever. By that evening, she had made a poultice for his ribs and a tea from the herbs. Vin drank it obediently, grimacing at the bitter taste. "My mother used to make something similar when I was sick as a child," he commented, his voice slightly stronger than it had been that morning. "My mother taught me," Jane said, sitting beside him. "She knew all about plants and their healing properties. She learned from a Ute woman who worked for one of the first families in Black Hawk." They talked quietly as night fell, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, the lives they had lived in parallel in the small mining town without truly knowing each other. Despite the danger of their situation, Jane felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in her life, she was making her own choices, charting her own course. For the next 3 days, they remained hidden at the cabin. Vin's condition improved slowly under Jane's care, though he was still far from fully recovered. They took turns keeping watch, always alert for the return of Iverson's search parties. On the 4th morning, as Jane was checking Vin's bandages, they heard the sound they had been dreading: horses approaching, multiple riders by the sound of it. "Back to the cellar," Vin whispered, but Jane shook her head. "Listen," she said, cocking her head. "They're not trying to be quiet." And there's a woman's voice. Sure enough, as the riders drew closer, they could hear a female voice calling out commands. It was familiar to both of them: Miriam Wells. "Vincent, Jane, are you here?" Jane and Vin exchanged shocked glances. Before they could decide what to do, the cabin door opened, and Miriam rushed in, followed by Sheriff Taylor and, to their astonishment, Jane's father. "Oh, thank God," Miriam cried, rushing to her son's side. "We've been searching everywhere for you." Sheriff Taylor surveyed the scene with a grim expression. "You two have caused quite a stir in Black Hawk. Iverson's claiming theft and kidnapping." "It wasn't theft," Vin protested weakly. "I only took my wages and the money he paid for Jane, which wasn't right in the first place." "You can't buy a person." "Legally, you can," the sheriff corrected, though he looked uncomfortable, "if her father agreed to the arrangement." Jane turned to her father, who had remained silent in the doorway. "How could you, father? How could you sell your own daughter like cattle?" Tobias Harper looked smaller somehow, diminished. The bluster and cruelty that had defined him for so long seemed to have drained away, leaving an old man with haunted eyes. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I've been wrong about a lot of things since your mother died. The drinking, the gambling. I've been a poor excuse for a father. But seeing what Iverson did when you disappeared, the rage, the cruelty, I realized what kind of man I'd given you to, and I couldn't live with myself." Jane stared at him in disbelief. "So what now? You've come to take me back to him." "No," Sheriff Taylor interjected. "That's not why we're here. Things have changed in Black Hawk since you two fled." He explained that Iverson's pursuit of them had revealed a side of the mine owner that many in town had suspected but never witnessed firsthand. His rage had led him to beat one of his workers, who suggested Jane and Vin might have already reached Denver. The man had died of his injuries, and Iverson now faced murder charges. "The territorial governor has been looking for an excuse to investigate Iverson's mines for years," the sheriff continued. "Safety violations, claims of claim jumping. This incident gave him the opening he needed. Iverson was arrested yesterday, and the contract between him and my father." Jane asked cautiously. "Null and void," Sheriff Taylor assured her. "You're a free woman, Jane, And as for the money Wells took, well, Iverson's ledgers showed he was owed at least that much in back wages for the dangerous shifts he worked. No theft charges will be filed. The relief that washed over both Jane and Vin was palpable. They could go home, they were safe, and most importantly, they were free. "I'm selling the cabin," Tobias announced suddenly. "Moving to my brother's place in Wyoming. Black Hawk holds too many bad memories, and I've done enough damage here." He approached Jane hesitantly. "I don't expect your forgiveness, daughter, but I want you to have the money from the sale. It's yours by right, should have been yours all along." Jane looked at the broken man before her, the father who had failed her so completely yet was now trying in his way to make amends. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said honestly, "but I'm willing to try with time." Tobias nodded, accepting this as more than he deserved. The journey back to Black Hawk was slow due to Vin's condition, but by the time they reached town, word of their return had spread. To Jane's surprise, many townspeople greeted them warmly. Iverson had not been a popular figure, it seemed, and the couple's dramatic escape had captured the town's imagination. Vin was brought to the doctor, who confirmed that his ribs were indeed broken, but healing properly thanks to Jane's care. The internal bleeding had been minor and was resolving itself. With rest and continued treatment, he would make a full recovery. During his convalescence at his mother's home, Jane visited daily, bringing food and books and staying to talk for hours. Their shared ordeal had forged a bond between them that grew stronger with each passing day. What had begun as an act of heroism on Vin's part and desperate gratitude on Jane's had blossomed into something deeper, more genuine, a love built on mutual respect, admiration, and the kind of understanding that only comes from facing death together. By the time summer turned to fall, Vin was fully recovered and had returned to his job at the Double R Ranch, though now as the foreman following Roger's retirement. Jane, with the money from her father's cabin sale, had opened a small school in Black Hawk, fulfilling her dream of teaching. On a crisp October day, with the aspen trees blazing gold against the blue Colorado sky, Vin took Jane riding into the mountains. They stopped at a familiar clearing, the site of the abandoned cabin where they had hidden, where they had first confessed their feelings for each other. "I bought it," Vin announced, gesturing to the cabin which had been repaired and improved. "This land, this cabin, it's ours if you want it." Jane looked at him in surprise. "Ours?" Vin dismounted, then helped her down from her horse. Taking both her hands in his, he looked into her eyes with a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "I love you, Jane Harper. I think I've loved you since before I knew what love was. These past months, getting to truly know you, have been the happiest of my life. I want to build a future with you here, where we found freedom together." He dropped to one knee, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a simple gold band set with a tiny sapphire. "Will you marry me, Jane? Not because anyone sold you or bought you, but because you choose to, of your own free will." Tears filled Jane's eyes as she looked down at the man before her, the man who had been willing to work himself to death for her freedom, who had never asked for anything in return, who loved her for exactly who she was. "Yes," she whispered, pulling him to his feet. "Yes, I choose you, Vincent Wells, today and every day." Their wedding, held in the small church in Black Hawk just before Christmas, was attended by nearly the entire town. Miriam Wells wept happy tears as she watched her son, handsome in a new suit, standing tall and proud beside Jane, radiant in a gown of ivory silk. The couple made their home in the renovated cabin, which Vin had expanded to include a proper kitchen and a small room that would serve as Jane's schoolroom during the winter months when the children couldn't travel to town. In the spring, they planted a garden where Jane grew both food and the medicinal herbs she had come to value during their time in hiding. The years passed peacefully. Jane's school flourished, eventually growing into Black Hawk's first proper academy. Vin continued as foreman at the Double R, implementing innovative ranching techniques that made it one of the most prosperous operations in Colorado. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl who grew up healthy and strong in the mountain air, learning both their father's skills with horses and their mother's love of books and plants. The Iverson mine, following its owner's conviction and imprisonment, was purchased by a consortium of investors who improved its safety and working conditions. Black Hawk continued to grow and prosper as the gold rush gave way to more sustainable industries. Occasionally, Jane and Vin would receive a letter from Tobias Harper in Wyoming. The relationship remained complicated, but over the years, a fragile reconciliation took shape. He never returned to Colorado, but when their first son was born, they sent him a daguerreotype, and his reply, tear-stained and grateful, suggested that some wounds, while never fully healed, could at least be survived. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Vin took Jane back to Clear Creek, to the spot where they had agreed to flee together. They sat by the water, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't overheard your father that day?" Vin asked, his arm around her shoulders. Jane leaned into him, considering the question. "I used to think it was just luck, good or bad, depending on the day, but now I think perhaps it was always meant to be. Not the suffering, not the fear, but this us finding each other, building this life together." Vin kissed her temple, his touch as gentle as it had been when he'd first dared to hold her hand in that abandoned cabin all those years ago. "Well, if it was fate, then fate has excellent taste." Jane laughed, the sound carrying across the water. "Indeed it does, Mr. Wells. Indeed it does." And as the last light of day faded from the sky, they made their way home, hand in hand, to the life they had fought for, suffered for, and ultimately chosen together.